Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to another MTG Arena Top Decks Deck Tech series here on my channel. Today I want to talk about the deck that I crushed ladder with yesterday and got super close to making it to the top 8 all in one day. In the last day I basically was like an hour short or so of making it. It's really just only time. The deck was crushing it. I was running at a 77% win rate. I was 30-9 in matches yesterday over the whole day, which is insane. The deck felt super good for the current metagame. So it's time to talk about it and share it with you guys. But before we move on to the deck list, you know the drill. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notification icon if you're new to the channel to not miss out on future content, and please consider whitelisting YouTube on your ad block to help support the content for free with ads. That would really mean a lot. Okay, on to the deck tech. Okay, so this is the Gruul Aggro deck that I played yesterday. It is kind of similar to the Gruul sort of mid-range Dragons deck that I recorded recently. And yeah, after basically playing that and having some success with it, I thought a bit more about it and tried other variations, and this is one of them. I tried to go a little lower, a little more aggressive. The 5-drops were a bit so-so, like it makes the deck a bit slower, it makes you play a land or two more. I was playing one more, but 2 more might have been ideal, and then you would have to cut other stuff, and it gives you a bit more room to fill out your curve on 2 and 3, and gives you a little more room for interaction to make the deck a bit more proactive and a bit smoother, and that turned out really well yesterday, as you may or may not have seen on my social media or on my stream if you were around. So let's talk about the cards first and the sideboard, and then I'll talk a bit about the deck in general and the matchups and stuff. So I think the cards that are pretty obvious in stock here and kind of non-touchable are for Llanowar Elves. I actually tried the red heavy Chain Whirler Shock Gruul the day before that Zhur-Taa played to a top 8 at GP Memphis, and also Jerry T posted his take on it to do the grind to Mythic, and Tim Wu managed to go 8-2 with his version at the Pro Tour, at the Mythic Championship. But yeah, somehow this felt a bit sluggish and a bit mediocre to me. I just couldn't get satisfying results with it. Like, it did okay, it won more than it lost, but not a whole lot, and it just kind of felt a bit wonky. So I gave up for it for now, just cycling through decks, trying to find something that immediately feels kind of dominant and kind of strong, like it could get the kind of win percentage that you need to climb fast. And this deck just didn't seem like it. So I went back to this, and I still really can't fully tell what sort of makes the difference here, but it does. Like, to some extent, I think it's Llanowar Elves and Pelt Collector just having a bit more early game, and also curves of like Llanowar Elves into Spellbreaker, or especially Llanowar Elves into Warboss on the play, reminiscent of Llanowar Elves into Rebel Master, and we all know how powerful that was. And yeah, just these seemingly kind of subtle differences seem to make a big difference in the end. Also slamming down a Phoenix on turn 3, having a bit more sideboard options, being heavier green, and stuff like that. So let's go back to the cards. Yeah, for Llanowar Elves, for Pelt Collector, not debatable, not touchable. Pelt Collector is basically like a 3-drop for 1 mana. The card easily gets to 3/3 or 4/4 in the deck, making it a 2 or 3-drop above curve for 1 mana, which is amazing. Keep in mind the fact that it also grows when something dies is making it grow so much faster. Like, playing a Kraul Harpooner and fighting something already gives it 2 counters. So if it was a 2/2 already and you like Kraul Harpooner something on turn 3 to trade, it's suddenly a 4/4 already if the Kraul Harpooner has undergrows 1 at least. Then we have for Growth Chamber Guardian, also basically a no-brainer. The card is a bit underwhelming without the activation. It's more of a like 2-mana 2/2 that's pseudo unblockable because you can just attack with the mana open without activating it, so the opponent can usually not block. But sure, the activation cost a bit clunky, but the card is virtually a great 5-drop in a deck with no 5-drop. It also lets you use mana on off turns really well, and then turning your Grizzly Bear into a 4/4 is a great deal. 4/4 is a very good size, especially against decks like Mono Red that have a lot of cards that deal 3, but basically none that deal 4, aside from sideboard cards. And the fact that it draws you up to 3 cards effectively over usually 2 to 3 turns is incredibly powerful and has won me a lot of games, especially against Mono Red, where the games usually end up pretty grindy because they cannot ignore your guys, because if they can't get through on the ground, they can't win before you do. So they have to kill your guys, and that's kind of a losing proposition for them, because a lot of your guys force them to be 2-for-1, Guardian, Spellbreaker, Phoenix, sometimes Pelt Collector, making their life really miserable and heavily relying on finding a frenzy in time without you having too much pressure to raid them. And Guardian has been amazing in these games. Also, Guardian is great when you flood out. I've won a fair share of games where I flooded and just had a Guardian doing the job against various decks, Mono Red, Mono White, and other like mid-rangey, grindier decks. The card has just been really impressive and is super good, and part of why the deck is as good as it is, because it gives it staying power that a deck like this usually doesn't have. Then we also definitely want at least 4 other 2-drops. Right now, I think Zhur-Taa Goblin is the right choice. I started with, yesterday I started playing with 4 Harpooner, 2 Goblin, because everyone was on like 4 Harpooner in their Gruul decks because of the Pro Tour and Mono Blue. But the reality is I faced like 1 Mono Blue guy in 40 to 50 matches, since the Pro Tour Mono Blue has basically disappeared from ladder, so there's just no point. And the 1 Mono Blue guy I faced, I fairly easily beat 2-0 with just 2 Harpooners. So I cannot recommend playing more than 2 Harpooners for now. The thing is, Zhur-Taa Goblin is surprisingly much better than a lot of people think. The fact that Harpooner has 2 toughness is a really big deal. There's Shock, there is Lava Runner, there's the Viashino Pyromancer, there's a ton of White Weenie creatures with 2 power, so basically Harpooner just trades with all of these. Zhur-Taa Goblin doesn't. Zhur-Taa Goblin is an amazing blocker against White Weenie, which is super important because that matchup is pretty tough. It also fights much better against Branchwalker and Jadelight Ranger if they draw lands instead of get counters. Jadelight Ranger often still ends up as 3/2, so it's not that relevant there, but Branchwalker, a fair share of the time, is like a 2/1. Also, occasionally the Sultai guy has to play like a 4-mana 2/2 Crassus, where this matters. There is Hostage Taker, where this can matter, because sure, Hostage Taker, taking your guy and replaying it right away is already really bad, but that doesn't have to be the end necessarily. You can sometimes still win. And then your Zhur-Taa Goblin not trading with their sort of already used up Hostage Taker that they just want to throw in front of something can be quite relevant. It also matters against Trickster, so even against Mono Blue, they both have their upsides, although Harpooner is overall more powerful. The other thing is, the fact that Zhur-Taa Goblin can be a 2/2 haste is also super relevant against Nexus and Esper. Those are both matchups where every damage counts and where you are really the hyper-aggressive deck and have to raise them as hard as you can, especially against Nexus, and going like, for example, turn 2 Guardian, and then, I don't know, turn 3 Warboss or Haste Spellbreaker, and then on turn 4 play like a Burn Spell, and a hasted Zhur-Taa Goblin instead of a regular Harpooner that just can't attack is pretty relevant. And Zhur-Taa Goblin does the same amount of damage over 3 turns than Harpooner does, because Harpooner attacks twice for 3 and Zhur-Taa Goblin 3 times for 2. So only on like the 3rd attack of the Harpooner or the 4th attack of the Goblin, the Harpooner deals 1 more damage. So that's also something to keep in mind. So I slowly moved back to like 3 and 3, and then even to 4 Goblins and 2 Harpooners, because I kept facing a a lot of white weenie and mono red and no mono blue. And then I faced my first mono blue guy and was curious how it's going to play out. And I was already on 2 Harpooners and yeah, won easily. My creatures just overwhelm them too much if you curve out, and then you have a bunch of interaction. It's just really hard for them to keep up. The result Phoenix is really strong. Even Warboss is very good because they don't have a lot of good blockers, so they can't just eat the tokens for free or the Warboss. So yeah, I am really happy with and confident in this configuration. Unless there's like a super big sea of mono blue like there used to be before the Pro Tour, before the Mythic Championship. And you also feel like this is not enough, then you can consider going back to 3 or 4 Harpooners and cutting back on Goblins. But overall, I think Goblin is a much better main deck card, and it is underrated, and people are just rushing too much for Harpooner. It's for the same reason I also didn't go for 4 Harpooner in the red-heavy Gruul list and just stuck to the 4 Zhur-Taa Goblins that Zhur-Taa Goblin ran, and he made it to a top 8 with 2 mono blue guys in a GP that probably was fairly heavy on mono blue. So I think these Gruul decks do just fine without main deck Harpooner, and it's fine to just have a bunch later to further cement your matchup, because I think you're already doing fairly well against mono blue. Okay, that was a pretty long aside on Goblin, but yeah, I think the card is really underrated. It's very flexible, and it's really good in the matchups that are tougher, like mono white, Nexus, and Esper, and part of why these matchups aren't tough anymore. Like, I think both of the combo control matchups are really good, and it's part due to the Riot creatures. Then for Spellbreaker are also non-debatable. Card is amazing. 3 mana 4/4 is great against especially mono red, but also potentially against mono white. You're gonna haste this much more often than make it a 4/4 compared to Zhur-Taa Goblin, which you're much more often going to play as a 3/3 than a 2/2 haste, since Spellbreaker deals 12 damage over 4 turns hasted and 12 damage over 4 turns non-hasted, since it gets 1 attack less. So only on the 5th turn, the 5th attack with the haste, you're losing out on 1 damage. And a lot of the time the game either doesn't last that long, or your Spellbreaker doesn't last that long. So unless the sizing is super important, like against mono red or sometimes against mono white, you almost always want to haste and get in there, except for when you need to block anyway, then you just play it as a 4/4. But this is mostly a 3 mana 3/3 trample haste, so keep that in mind. That's pretty important for the deck. And the other thing is, I think Warboss in some number is also not debatable, but I think the Force 1 is touchable, so I could see debating the Force 1, since the card is a bit fragile and can be a bit lackluster in some matchups, but the way the deck plays out, I've been fairly happy with 4, and the situativity of Warboss has been kept to a minimum. Sure, there are some matchups where you take it out, but even in the matchups where you take it out, I didn't hate it game 1. It's just not ideal and can be situationally awkward, because depending on how the game develops and the board looks, the card could be semi-blanked, so you don't want to risk that. But all in all, the card has been pretty good. But yeah, I think the Force 1 is debatable. So if you're looking to change something, that's one of the cards that I can see touching. And then we have the 4 Rekindling Phoenix. This is also absolutely non-debatable. The card is amazing, one of the best cards in the deck. A lot of matchups stand and interactive matchups stand and fall with Phoenix. White weenie, mono blue, mono red. These matchups hinge a lot on Phoenix. Against Sultai, it's your best card. The card is just a powerhouse and fairly hard to deal with for a lot of decks right now, and flying is also pretty good against a lot of decks, either for blocking or for just not being blocked. And the last card that I think is also non-debatable are 4 Lightning Strikes. Yes, 4 Lightning Strike, no Lava Coil. Lightning Strike is amazing. I think it is very important that a deck runs 4 Lightning Strike over Lava Coils in the main, like a lot of red decks that are not mono red aggro recently have been gravitating towards Lava Coil, like Shota has a 2-2 split, Jerry opted for 3 Lava Coils, 3 and a third Collision Colossus over the force, like Strike or Coil, and has 0 strikes. And I think the way the deck plays out, it is very aggressive, so being able to deal 3 damage either to a player or Planeswalker is very relevant. I've killed my fair share of Teferis with Lightning Strike to keep the Esper player on as small of a hand as I have. I've won a fair share of Esper games by them just kind of top decking and trying to keep up with my stuff because they draw a bit more lands than me and take damage from everything I play, and in the end they sit there with 1 or 2 cards. I have like maybe a card less than they do, a few lands less, and just we're kind of fighting a top deck war, and that's only possible because they often are forced to minus the Teferi. And then you can Lightning Strike it, or you can or they can play it, you haste, you end of turn Lightning Strike it and then attack it with a haster to finish it off with a Zhur-Taa Goblin or Spellbreaker. So Lava Coil can't do that. Then sometimes you just win against Esper by Lightning Striking their face, even more so against Nexus. That's especially nice because sometimes they can't afford to Root Snare because they're like, okay, I'm enough damage off, and if he has like a Colossus, I can still Root Snare, so I rather go to like 2 or 3 because I need that extra turn. And then when they're forced to do that to increase their chance of going off, then you can just punish them with Lightning Strike, or sometimes you get them in Lightning Strike range a turn before and then draw a Lightning Strike to finish them off, where they are hoping to buy another turn with Root Snare and stuff. So just not being blank is pretty relevant. Sometimes it being an instant speed removal also matters against opposing haste creatures like out of mono red, or just in combat opponents are a fair share forced to double block against you, like White Weenie for example. Also being able to immediately kill Benalish Marshal mid-combat the turn they play it to get better blocks and blow them out is really big. The instant speed also matters quite a bunch against mono blue, sometimes to keep that trickster from blowing you out, like killing your Warboss or whatever, or just killing their session creature at an opportune time. There's a lot of things, like Lightning Strike has been amazing, and it still does all the things that you need it to do, like for example kill White Gross Walker. There's really not much where Lava Coil matters. It's basically Phoenix, and I don't see that many, and mono red usually only has them in the sideboard if they play them, so then you have Lava Coils anyway. So game 1 there is not a lot of Phoenix decks. I didn't like the red heavy Gruul and Rakdos decks for Phoenixes. Don't seem very popular. I didn't face them a whole lot. If they were, it would be a bit closer, but they would have to be really popular, I think, for it to go back to maybe like a 2-2 split like Shota did, and that's the most I would probably do. And yeah, like it's just the only other thing that Lava Coil I think matters against are Drakes and Djinn. And for Djinn and Drakes you already have Collision Colossus as well and Harpooners to try and deal with them. Then Drakes is a fairly good matchup anyway and not very popular. Mono blue isn't very popular right now on ladder either, and even if it is, Djinn is not necessarily where the matchup gets decided, because I won a fair share of games where I just could turn my board sideways into a Djinn once or twice and win that way because they're behind. Or if they slam Djinn, you can slam Phoenix and that matches the Djinn. Or they like have to block a Warboss token or something small and you just Lightning Strike it anyway. And if that doesn't work, Lava Coil wouldn't have worked either. So yeah, all in all, I feel very strongly about Lightning Strike, and I think the card is very important to the deck and really amazing and much better than Lava Coil. Okay, so on to the last slots. I basically started with 4 Collision Colossus, but I felt like 4 is a bit much because the deck then suddenly has a ton of 2-cost cards and not that many 1-cost cards, giving you a bunch of awkward off turns. Also you have 8 3-drops, so you also have some mismatches there on 4 mana and on 3 mana, either because you don't have a 3-drop but more 2-drops, or on 4 you have additional 3-drops but no Phoenix. So, and also the same goes for like Gross Chamber Guardian activation, which is virtually another 3-drop. So, also Collision Colossus, when it's bad, it has been pretty bad, because then it's mostly like 2 mana for damage to the face. If there's like more racing going on, the opponent isn't really blocking and doesn't have flyers. Like against White Weenie, for example, Collision Colossus is very bad. And that matchup has been tricky and fairly popular. So I eventually decided to make the curve a bit smoother, a bit sleeker, and give me a bit more interaction against like White Weenie especially, but also a bit cheaper interaction against like Mono Blue and Mono Red. The Mono Red matchup has been favorable, but Collision Colossus is also very bad there, so getting a bit of an improvement there doesn't hurt, because they can still get you. Like the matchup is not a sealed deal, but it is favorable. So I decided to split it 2 and 2 with Shock, just to get a little more 1-cost cards in there, also allowing me to go for a bit more heavy-hitting, clunkier sideboard cards, because I initially had 1 to 2 Sheath and Fire on the board to have a bit more cheap and flexible interaction for a wider range of matchups post-sideboard where I need it. So that was pretty nice too, allowing me to go to like more Lava Coils and Cannonades on the board. I'll talk about that in a moment. So yeah, I've been pretty happy with that. I think the most that you probably want is like the 3 Collision Colossus that Jerry T had in his list. That seems like a good number. The 4th is maybe just a bit too situational and too clunky in too many matchups. It's not quite Gorklan Rampager, since when Rampager didn't do anything as like a trick, you just could play it as a 4/4 Overwhelm and a 4/4 Trample. And a 4/4 Trample happened to be really good against the type of decks that a +4/+4 Trample combat trick wasn't. Like Rampager would be great as a creature against Mono White or Mono Red, for example, where it wouldn't be good as a trick. But Collision is not very good against Mono Red or Mono White, so the alternate mode of Colossus doesn't really work here. So yeah, Shock has been decent. Shock also still does the whole like finish Planeswalkers after their minus ability, like Vivian or Teferi, especially Teferi. It also can accumulate additional direct damage through Root Snare to burn out Nexus players. I've burned out a Nexus player from 7 with double strike Shock in one game, where he just didn't see it coming and died on his upkeep, probably being pretty frustrated. Also, Shock is pretty good against Llanowar Elves, against Zhur-Taa, which can give you a huge speed boost, giving the deck a bit more turn 1 plays. Like sometimes if you don't have your Elf or your Pelt Collector, now you can just have a Shock to still keep parity or get ahead on your opponent by killing their 1-drop and curving out still, because your creatures are so much bigger than most other creatures. And then we have the 2 Kraul Harpooners. That is the other card that I could see touching. Like, I'm not sure if the deck would be a bit too low on creatures if you cut them, especially for like Pelt Collector and stuff, but the card has been a bit mediocre, like I said, unless you're facing Mono Blue, where there's a lot of 1/1s that you can 2-for-1 by fighting them and not trading. Turning this into like a Colossus, Collision basically, is not very impressive. Especially Collision is a situational card, and the 3/2 is not very good when the reach and fight don't matter much, because a lot of 1-drops and stuff and 1-cost cards like Shock deal 2 damage, so it trades down a lot. It races reasonably well against like Nexus or Esper, because it's a 2-cost 3-power threat, so that is nice. But I could see considering something like cutting the Harpooners for 3rd Shock and a 3rd Collision, giving the deck a bit more further interaction and a bit more burst potential to just kind of win games a turn earlier, especially where you have to race, and also in matchups that can get problematic the longer they go, like against Zhur-Taa. So I could totally see, and also would make Warboss better in matchups where it faces more resistance on the board. So I could totally see trying to test something like 3 Shocks, 3 Collision Colossus, and 0 Harpooner, but could be a bit light on curving potential there, and the deck might want the additional 2-drops. But then again, every time you have a Llanowar Elves, you're kind of playing a 3-drop anyway and skipping your 2. So going down on 2 drops doesn't seem like the worst. So I could definitely see trying that. And then we just have like 22 lands. Even distribution, I considered 8 forests and 6 mountains, and it's something that you could try if you feel like you're not playing your green 1-drops often enough. But all in all, I rarely had hands that were like keepable or like mountains only, where I couldn't play the 1-drops because of that. So I didn't really go for it. I briefly played with 8/6, but the other problem is 15 sources is like the sort of minimum reliable amount for Phoenix, and the deck sometimes already struggled a bit to find the second red in time to drop Phoenix, and Phoenix is so good and so important that it seems dangerous to play with the reliability of it. But 8/6 might be a slight improvement. I'm not 100% sure. I wasn't too unhappy with how the deck performed with the current mana base, even though I know that 11 turn 1 green sources is suboptimal for 8 green 1-drops, which is the main reason why I considered a change. But I noticed that I tendentially had a bit more, struggled a bit more with the second red for Phoenix than with the turn 1 green for my 1-drops when I had them. So I stuck to the 7/7, but yeah, if you notice something, I can definitely see trying 8/6. I could also see trying cutting 1 mountain for an unclaimed territory, or maybe even a mountain and a forest. That would bring up the turn 1 green sources to 12, while also keeping the red sources at 15, or even bringing it to 16 if you cut a forest for a second territory. I think I'm actually going to add 1 territory. I'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so add the territory, cut a mountain. So I don't think I want 2 territories, the main reason being Zhur-Taa Goblin. Like if you go turn 1 territory on Elf or Warrior, you can't play Zhur-Taa Goblin, because Zhur-Taa Goblin is a Goblin Berserker. So that's a big issue here. But territory, if you draw it later, you can still name Phoenix with it, if you have like a green and a red already. So it still doesn't reduce your chance of Phoenix as much as going to 8/6, but still increases your chance of a turn 1 green 1-drop significantly. You usually want to name Elf or Warrior. Warrior if you have Pelt Collector, Elf if you have Llanowar Elves, then you can still play Pelt Collector and Guardian with it. And if you name Warrior, it also works as a green source for Harpooner and a green or red source for Gruul Spellbreaker, because it's a Warrior as well. So I think that's kind of a nice hedge maybe, and a sort of a nice compromise in between, and something that I'm going to play from here on out to test it. Another reason to not cut a forest for a second one is the sideboard Vivian Reeds and Threshing Brontodons, because they would be hurt significantly by that, since you really can't realistically afford to name Dinosaur. So yeah, I think that might be a nice improvement to the 1-drops without hurting the Phoenix too much. So I'm going to try that. If you feel like it's giving you too much issues, just go back to the 7/7 or 8/6, depending on how things develop. Also, the deck still has 17 forests and mountains for Rootbound Crag, so I don't think 1 territory is going to hurt Rootbound Crag too much. But that's another reason not wanting to go to 2, because then you could get into situations where you have territory Rootbound Crag hands and can't play a 2-drop on turn 2 and stuff like that, and hurting your curving more than just not having a turn 1 green for your 1-drop. Okay, last but not least, I want to talk about the sideboard. I tried a bunch of things. I started on like 3 Lava Coil, but eventually settled on 4 Lava Coil, cutting the 1 Shivan Fire that I had until then, simply because I think against other Phoenix decks it's too important to have 4 Lava Coil postboard. Also against Drakes or Mono Blue, having the additional answers to Drakes and Jin is nice. Against mono blue it's not that relevant. I think against mono blue Sheevan Fire might even be better, but this is not much worse. And against Drakes, having 4 Lava Coil, especially with fewer collisions, is pretty good. And even against Zhur-Taa this is nice because it gives you 8 outs to a hostage taker, which is pretty important. Also exiling can be quite relevant on White Cross Walker, Crassus, or hostage taker, because then they can't get it back with find, which can make a huge difference in grindier games. So yeah, you just basically want additional removal for the creature matchups, mostly mono blue, mono red, and mono white, to just make sure they don't overwhelm you on the board, or in case of mono red, get any creature damage in. Also because they potentially board into Phoenixes in mono red. It also obviously comes in handy against random 2-color decks like Rakdos, Gruul, all that sort of stuff. So it's just a very good sideboard card to have. Then we have Cindervines. I started on 4, but first of all, the Simic matchup is surprisingly good. I won most of my game 1s already by just racing. Like, a lot of decks are boarding Warboss against Simic Nexus, so we have 4 Warboss main and we can play it on turn 2, and have like 8 hasters and a 1-drop that grows pretty quickly, so our clock is really good. So especially on the play, game 1 is pretty favorable, and usually if they went off game 1, a lot of the time they had to go off so early and desperately that they fizzled. So their fizzle rate is really high. Either they can't go off in the first place, or they have to go off with a super high fizzle rate, just basically hoping to runner into it. And Cindervines in this deck is basically only good against that matchup. And yeah, I don't bring it in against control. We don't have enough bad cards to bring in a mediocre card like this. If you have more bad cards, I can see bringing it in, because it's kind of something that sits there, deals them damage, and they have a hard time interacting with it. It limits the amount of spells they can play, but it's usually worse than a creature, especially creatures with haste, and the damage is pretty marginal. Like, I saw Zhur-Taa in his sideboard card in the red-green, not like green-red Gruul deck, has 4 in the sideboard and is boarding them in against Esper, which honestly surprised me a bit, because he's boarding a lot of cards there, and I'm not sure how much I like Cindervines against Esper. And in this deck I definitely don't want it, so it's literally only here for Nexus. Normally you would potentially bring it in against mono red as well, because it puts them under a clock while they clock you, and it deals with frenzy, which is very important. But we have Brontodon for that, so I'll talk about that in a moment. So yeah, after a bit I started shaving the 4th copy of this for a 3rd Brontodon, because Brontodon is still fine against them, sometimes a bit slow, especially on the draw without a mana elf, because then they get at least 1 free Reclamation untapped, not being as much of a tempo swing if Reclamation costs them effectively 0 mana, but getting it off the table is still more important than time walking them with it. So I could even see going down to 2 potentially, probably not for Force Brontodon. You still have 5 enchantment removal and can bring in Vivien, especially on the play, just to overload the enchantments, because they are under enough pressure and struggling already. So Vivien is surprisingly fine against them, but I'll talk about that in a moment. So yeah, I could see cutting a Cindervines for another card, possibly, because it's a very narrow sideboard card for a matchup that we're already doing pretty well in and have other sideboard cards for. I have not yet lost to Nexus yesterday. I think I beat it 3 or 4 times. Fairly easily, often 2-0 or sometimes 2-1, losing a game on the draw, where they had a good draw and I had only like a decent draw. Then we have Fiery Cannonade. I'm not the biggest fan of the card. The card is situational and can be really bad against White Weenie. They can have board states where you just draw a Cannonade and it doesn't do anything, because too many of the guys are already big, and or they have Hunted Witnesses, bodyguards targeting something, sentries and or marshals, and Loxodons, all the stuff that doesn't die to this. But when you're falling behind and they have their like heavy curve draws with a lot of 1-drops, being able to catch up from that, killing 2 or 3 cards is really strong. Like, I played a match against Olorade yesterday in the like top 30, top 40. He was on Azorius, like White Weenie with blue, and there was that game where he went 1-drop into 1-drop into History of Benalia, and then in the beginning of the main phase, after the history trick made the second token, I just Fiery Cannonaded all 4 creatures away, which in response to him playing a Loxodon, being super powerful. And the matchup is quite tricky, and if they only draw like 2 or 3 lands and all gas and have the explosive triple 1-drop draws, it's really hard to beat them for us, especially if we draw a couple of extra lands. And Cannonade is very good at catching up there. It's really only for that matchup and potentially Selesnya tokens, which I have never faced and don't know if it's even a problematic matchup, but if it is, this can come in handy there. I don't want it against mono blue or mono red, it's pretty bad there. So yeah, this is just 2 slots for a tough matchup in White Weenie, and kind of seems necessary. Initially these were 2 Sheev and Fire for the beginning of the testing, of the climb, but eventually I lost a couple of times to good White Weenie draws where they stopped at 2 or 3 lands, and I added Cannonades just to make sure I can reliably beat them, which is important during the climb to not lose, basically, as we all know. So you want to cover your bases where you are the most vulnerable. Then we have Threshing Brontodon. This card is pretty amazing, actually. First of all, it's still fine against Nexus. Sure, Cindervines is cheaper, deals damage, blah blah blah, but that is not that important. The way this deck plays out, you have enough of a clock. It's really only about getting that enchantment off the board. The extra damage from Cindervines just icing on the cake, and usually kind of negligible even in the way you clock them. You usually overclock them anyway. Like, I usually overkill them in the turn that I kill them, so a couple extra damage from Cindervines doesn't do a whole lot. It might matter in a game where you get them low and then they try to go off before you get another turn to overkill them, and then if they don't have an out, Cindervines could kill them during combo, but that hasn't happened so far yet. And then Brontodon is just something that does something if they does more, sort of, if they don't have an enchantment yet. And it's much, much better in other matchups. The card is great against mono red. First of all, 4 toughness is exactly what you want against mono red. Dropping a bunch of 4 toughness creatures in Spellbreaker and Brontodon usually stalls them out on the ground and forces them to 2-for-1 themselves, which is amazing. Also, it gives you insurance against one of the best cards against us, which is Experimental Frenzy. And yeah, this deals with it. So it covers both your bases. It's a hard to deal with creature, a good blocker, and an answer to Frenzy. Everything you need, basically. Also an answer to Expedition Map, if they bring it in, which I doubt in that matchup. So yeah, that's where decks like the Shoda Jerry red heavy list has to bring in Cindervines against mono red because they can't support Brontodon with their mana base, which is okay but not great. And Brontodon is like an actively good card, while Cindervines is just like okay and mostly a necessary evil to not lose to Frenzy, because you lose to Frenzy a lot. That's like the main way you lose in my experience. And yeah, Brontodon also happens to be quite good against White Weenie. First of all, 4 toughness is bigger than most of their creatures, unless they have a lot of Ansem type stuff. So it's a pretty good body there. And it protects your Phoenix from Tribunal. So you don't wanna run this out too early. Like if you can play something else like a Spellbreaker, just play that. And ideally play your Phoenix before it, and then if they Tribunal your Phoenix, you play Brontodon and kill the Tribunal to get the Phoenix back. In most other cases it's irrelevant, because then you're just 1-for-1ing and probably even trading negative on tempo. But Phoenix is really powerful. It's near impossible for them to attack into it unless they can kill you over 1 or 2 turns, because Phoenix just grinds them down really well. And also Phoenix is often your best way to go on the offense if you have got the ground locked up. So Phoenix is very important there. Tribunal is their only answer for it, and Brontodon answers their answer for Phoenix. So that is also pretty good. So yeah, the 3 Brontodons have been great. And yeah, I'm really happy with those, and they are overall a better sideboard card than Cinder Vines, while sort of covering the same base, since the unique effects of Cinder Vines aren't that important against Nexus with this deck in my experience. And last but not least, we have Vivian Reed. I tried a couple other things here. I initially had like 2 Vivian and something like 2 Karn or Karn and a Domri. I considered the Immortal Sun. The problem with the Immortal Sun is it costs 6 in a 22 land deck. That's a lot. And also it's very slow in a fairly aggressive deck. So I just didn't see the deck playing out in a way that Immortal Sun is that great. Also, it's worse, I think, if you don't have Siege Gang, because the +1/+1 effect is super powerful. Like going Siege Gang into the Immortal Sun post sideboard is really strong. Like, for example, playing a bunch of guys, they Kaya's Ratio, you go Siege Gang, they can't sweep it, you play the Immortal Sun, and then suddenly the game is over. Not the case here. Your creatures are all pretty strong individual threats, not going very wide, so the Immortal Sun doesn't do that much. In that regard, sure, it still draws you 2 cards a turn and locks out Planeswalkers, but it also potentially locks out the Planeswalkers you might play alongside it, so you don't really want to mix and match that. And Expedition Map is really bad in this deck, so it's not a good alternative. And yeah, basically when I wanted to free up a slot for more anti-creature, especially anti-White Weenie interaction, I decided to try 3 Vivian, because Vivian has impressed me the most of the Planeswalkers anyway. Khan is a bit meh, like he doesn't threaten an ultimate, he just draws an extra card each turn, and every other turn he draws the worst card you could draw, and then every other turn he draws the best of the top 2 cards of your deck, taking up and down. Basically the -2 doesn't really do anything. And Domri has other issues. Domri basically having to -3 to get your card advantage can be problematic. The whiff chance to only get 1 or 0 creatures is still reasonable, so you might not always get a 2-for-1 there, and then the opponent might even be able to kill it, especially against more mid-range decks, where your Planeswalkers are less safe. Going down to, I think, 1 loyalty on Domri is fairly costly. And then the plus ability is very weak against Esper. It's fine because the haste on all your creatures, and especially haste on like late game big Kraul Harpooners, can be sweet, but in order to get to the ultimate you have to only plus, and plus doesn't generate card advantage, so yeah, you are torn between getting card advantage out of your Planeswalker, which is what you want, or threatening the ultimate. While Vivian does both. Vivian gets card advantage and threatens the ult, while also having a good minus that protects you from something like Lyra that can kill their Search for Iskanta occasionally if it doesn't flip that early or they play it later. It also can come in against matchups like Simic potentially, especially on the play, because it is an answer to their Krasis that might stall you out. It's an answer to their Search for Iskanta and their Reclamation, and like I said, it's more important to get rid of them than get rid of them right away and deny them playing the Reclamation for 0 mana effectively. So the multi-purpose and so on of Vivian is much, much better. Also, she has 1 more loyalty, and she works towards an ultimate while generating an advantage. And yeah, so I decided to go to 3 Vivian and haven't looked back since. I'm very happy with it. She's also a pretty good threat in mid-range mirrors, especially the pseudo mirror against other Gruul decks, or against Sultai when you can like sort of lock up the board, stall out the game, and just tick up Vivian and threaten her ultimate. So yeah, just been a great card overall, and all 3 of her modes are very very useful and relevant, sometimes even giving you removal insurance in matchups where you don't want to keep removal like Collision Colossus in for big flyers, which is great. And yeah, it's just a much more sound and coherent Planeswalker design than Domri, which is kind of pulling into 2 different directions, even though the -3 drawing you 2 cards immediately and drawing you 2 threats usually is very tempting and being cheaper and having the haste option, but it's just the modes are kind of reversed. If if the modes were the other way around and ticking up would give you a card advantage to work towards the ultimate, would be much better. But obviously then the whole Planeswalker would need to change, because you can't +1 to draw like 2 creatures. That's clearly a minus ability. So yeah, Domri has those issues basically. Yeah, that's the deck. That's the sideboard. Been really impressed by the deck. It's the highest win rate I had so far on Arena. Almost 77%. It's insane. I'm going to keep messing with the deck. Maybe try shaving a Warboss or a Shock or a Collision Colossus or even a third Harpooner, or maybe trying to cut the 2 Harpooners for a Shock and a Collision Colossus like I said. But that's like all the changes I can really see. I've been pretty happy with 2 to 3 Collision Colossus. The 4 have just been a bit much. And yeah, the deck works really well. The card choices mostly kind of determine themselves. I think one of the more critical points is realizing how much better Zhur-Taa Goblin is than it looks and then people think, and not being too tempted into overloading on Harpooners, which end up just suffering from the usual 2 toughness 2-drop issue. 3 toughness on a 2-drop is just very, very valuable most of the time, and that's where Zhur-Taa Goblin's strength lies. And also in the flexibility of having haste in matchups where speed matters. So it would already be a bit better than Harpooner as a main deck card if it was just a Watch Wolf, a 2 mana 3/3, but adding the like haste mode makes it so good. It's just an amazing main deck card, and Harpooner is still a bit more of a sideboard card, I think. Alright, that's it for the deck tech. That was a pretty long one. Hope you guys appreciate the in-depth rundown. There was a lot to say about the deck and the card choices and the ins and outs. I learned a lot about the deck in the last 2 days, so I wanted to share that with you guys. And as usual, we're gonna hop into some matches. I'm gonna play 3 best of 3 ranked matches. Ladder has reset by now. I have made it to rank 14 with the deck yesterday. Before time ran out, I had 2 wins into 14. I won, made 14, won again, stayed 14, and then got into my last match, won, and when I got out of the match, it already reset, so I didn't see my final rank. So I might have still been 14 with 2 wins, or maybe jump to 13 or 12. Maybe there will be like final standings posted and I can see where we ended up in the end, but the lowest will be 14, I'm pretty sure, given that we were a win or 2 cemented on 14. Yeah, and one quick thing regarding matchups. Basically mono blue, the one time I faced it felt favorable. I have a favorable record against mono red. You just have to manage the game properly. You have to understand when you need to raise and when you need to stall, and get as much damage in as possible while taking as little damage as possible, and force them to 2-for-1 themselves against your creatures a lot. Take good double blocks against Chain Whirler if you can't kill it with removal and stuff like that. White Weenie, their best draws are near unbeatable, except maybe for Cannonade out of the sideboard. Their average or below average draws are very beatable with a bit of removal and outsizing creatures, but yeah, if they stop at 2 or 3 mana and draw all gas and curve out well, then you have little to no chance. I lost to Alia Deshane twice yesterday, for example. She was on mono white and made it in at 8s, so congrats to her. And yeah, she was part of the reason why I upped my defenses against White Weenie. Esper has been really good. I think I lost at most 1 game against Esper. I think I faced it 4 or 5 times, beating it 2-0 every time, or almost every time. I think I might have lost 1 game against the last Esper guy I played, but not 100% sure. Nexus similar. Lost a couple more games to it, but never a match. Matchup feels very favorable. Game 1 is already solid, and post-sideboard it's just way worse for them with so many answers for their key cards. And yeah, that I think covers all the important matchups. Sultai is the other matchup that I'm not super excited about, but I have a positive record against Sultai yesterday. I think I went like 4-2 against it or something. So yeah, Sultai being a close matchup, but might be better in reality than it looks on paper, because on paper it looks bad, but in reality there's a lot of spots where you can leverage your pressure and your advantage, and if they don't have like the picture perfect smooth draw with everything, they are quite susceptible to just being like pressured and beat down by us quite well with removal or trick here and there to destabilize them. So, but yeah, if you see a ton of White Weenie and Zhur-Taa, you might want to play a different deck. Okay, that's it for the deck tech. Time for the matches. So, yeah, if you enjoy the content, subscribe, hit the like button, share it with your friends. Let me know in the comments what you think. And yeah, that's it again for the deck tech. See you in a moment with the first match. Stay tuned.